Hi, everybody. This is Tamara Childs, intuitive psychic, and I am here with Ruth McCants, sound healer and astrology maven. I don't know. What shall we call you today?
That's a new one, Maven. I
Yeah.
like astrology Maven. I like that.
Sometimes it's hard to pinpoint our gifts that we have, and this is so interesting, Ruth, because I was just thinking this morning, a thought that there are people who have a gift that is so refined that it becomes very noticeable to others. It's so developed and refined and specific. And then many people who are watching this, our friends and our followers and all of the wonderful sensitive creatives who watch us, um, you might not think of yourself as having gifts, or you might think, well, I just don't have that. There's nothing here that's shining in me. And I want to challenge you for today's show to really think about shining a light on the gifts that you may have that you haven't noticed before. I think that's a really important note for today.
Were you inside my mind this morning? What were you walking around in here this morning?
Well, always, but
I was looking at a young neighbor who seems to be, he's kind of in and out of his house and around. But there was something that really caught my attention. He has two automobiles. One is maybe a 20-year-old car. And for all his going in and out and around, he apparently made a decision that he was going to restore this car. And I was fascinated this morning because what it brought to mind is how every person, just as you pointed out, has a unique gift of some kind. And sometimes we can't see it as readily, and we might say, oh, that person never does anything. But if we watch really closely, we begin to see it. And I, like I said, I'm really fascinated because he stripped this car down. It had dents. The engine sounded terrible. And now he's roaring around the neighborhood in this restored car. And who would have thought?
interesting story, because I think of, we're going to talk today about Jupiter and Scorpio. Today is, I don't know, did I already say it's the 12th of October, 2017? And this week, Jupiter moved into Scorpio, which is a big event because Jupiter is the planet that influences our expansion each year. And we're just moved out of Jupiter in Libra, which is a very different tone than Scorpio. And I think of Scorpio as being restorative. That one of the
very good word.
Yeah, you were saying before we got on here about the expansion and the healing of Jupiter and Scorpio, and I'd love you to say more about that.
Well, the restorative, that's what he's done in terms of that automobile. He's taken something that could potentially be in decay, and it was, because Scorpio is about things that are of no use to us any longer. So we've got restoration, but as things pass off the scene, because when something dies, because we also have to own the word death and dying, but death and dying brings rebirth, and rebirth brings healing.
Yeah, an interesting idea about that too. It's funny, as you said that, I'm having a memory. Some of my followers know that I had a brother who died when I was young, when we were children. I was 9 and he was 5, and the process, he had a chronic illness, and so every day I would come home from school and I would check on him, and there was this path that I took, like a shortcut through the woods, and there was a dead bird there, and I became very fascinated during the time of my brother dying. I was very interested in death and curious, and so I would look at this dead bird on this path, by this path on the pine needles, every day after school. And through the fall, I would be like, and each day it would be a little more decomposed. And here, I guess I wasn't expecting to tell this story, but I guess what I want to say is that, finally there was a day, probably, 9 months later or something. I remember in the spring after the winter, I checked where the bird was and it was no longer there. When something dies, we can't control where that energy goes.
Yes.
It will bring new life, but maybe not in the way that we think. And I think that's what's hard about Scorpio for people, and death, by the way, is we can't control something that is so transformative.
Absolutely. And something that I've, in witnessing numbers of people who passed off the scene, it totally rearranges the energy, because death, as is life, is really an energy.
Mm-hmm.
It's connected to the energy of the cosmos, however you want to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
But within our family units, within our society, everything gets rearranged. And that's the thing that we sometimes want to control it, but we can't, because if I no longer have parents, they moved off the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And that rearranged the constellation within my whole family unit, because their energy was transformed into another energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we need to keep in mind, particularly over the course of this next 13 months or so of Jupiter being in Scorpio. There are going to be some things in our lives that are going to get rearranged.
Well, and Scorpio doesn't do it halfway. Like, we don't die halfway, and we're not born halfway.
That's right.
We're born, and
Yes.
when we die, there's a moment where we're, in the other realm. And so Scorpio doesn't allow us. There's a lot coming out of the closet right now this week with, I'm just going to name Harvey Weinstein, for example. And so there have been some other, the head of Miramax Productions, and, just media mogul,
Right.
With all of the sexual misconduct charges. And there's a lot of that going on right now in the world that we're hearing about more and more, and women coming out and speaking. And to me, don't you think that's a Jupiter and Scorpio event?
Well, it's a Jupiter and Scorpio event, and we have to, at the same time, look at it as both a personal and a collective event within the society. Our society, as a whole, has tended to keep a lid on things that have been seen as I'm going to use words just very descriptive, dirty.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate in a strange way that women have been associated with things that are dark and hidden. And now Scorpio is about bringing that energy, because we all must have balance. See, we just left Libra. Libra said, okay, I'm going to propose. Balance has to do with both the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine. And now Scorpio is saying, you're going to put up or shut up, because we're going to bring all of that to the surface.
Well, and it's interesting that you're mentioning about how women are perceived as the dark, or and it's interesting this week because I've seen a number of posts just on social media. There was one post that was about awareness about sexual violence, and that part of the awareness is not using a passive voice when discussing crimes against women. So, for example, we'll say, this statistic, this number of women were raped this year, but we don't say anything about the men who raped them. Or we'll say this many girls got pregnant, but we won't say this many men impregnated them. And so there's a lot in our collective right now that's coming out about the things we don't and never want to talk about. And I can't wait to see what happens with race this year, but it just feels to me like
those are all the things that are in our psyche. You see, we're looking, we yes, we look at the outer expressions, but this is what inhabits. Now, if we want to move to the 12th house, particularly Neptune, Piscean kinds of energy, if we want to describe it, astrologically, we're looking at what's called the shadow, the things that we conceive of as being too raw, too bad. Again, I'm using the word too dirty, too negative.
And also the 8th house. It's so
yes, together.
I was reading an article about in the New Yorker today about Weinstein, and how a person like that can't sort of perpetrate alone. He had a whole fear system set up so that everybody who worked for him, the assistants would set up the meetings and leave this girl who was maybe from another country, a model or an actress, vulnerable in a hotel suite with him. And they knew that she was going to be traumatized and scared. And nobody wanted to speak up because this person had accrued so much power in media. And it's so funny because one of the cards I drew today for the reading is the devil. And it is how we can be enslaved by our fears of perceived power in the world. Right. And this is so relevant right now.
And this is what we all are faced with. How do we begin to own our own disempowerment? How do we each within begin to own the feelings of disenfranchisement in some shape or form? It's like we have to look at our lives and say, where is it that I've given someone else more power over me? I have said, I don't have any uniqueness, but that person does.
Because it's always a conversation between the powerful and the powerless, or the empowered part of you and the part that feels disempowered or victimed. Because we Scorpio is all about this. It's all about power and sexual power, and where are we holding our power or giving our power away? I mean, it was fascinating to read this article because it was really interviews with each of the people who were coming forward, and they were just saying, I was just scared because this person was scary and powerful, and he was a physically big person. And then there's a reflection for many of the victims, probably all of them, on they wish that they had done something or said something sooner, but part of them gave into that power dynamic and did not use their power effectively in the situation. They weren't sure what to do. Yeah.
And you bring up an excellent point, because what this does, Jupiter is giving us an indication, particularly when it moves into Sagittarius. It asks us the question, how are we going to teach both our children, male and female children? How are we going to do better? That's the real issue. If these young women who faced this man were totally scared, each one of us, we're sitting at a juncture in our collective road.
Oh, yeah.
That's saying, how are we going to do better? We've got to teach our girls to have voices, and we have to teach our sons to understand what it means to respect the young woman that he or she happens to be with.
Oh, I mean, this is going to be the most interesting year. And I'm so grateful that you brought up teaching, because with Scorpio, we have the underbelly. We have the deepest, darkest, most shameful parts, and because it's all second and first chakra, it's the regenerative organs,
it's regenerative,
reproductive organs,
right? And the creativity, because we got creativity and reproduction together.
And that Jupiter is a benefic influence. So it is here to help. It will make things bigger. So we're going to see a lot of this, a lot of discussion about it. A lot of people are going to have memories come up for them of their own power dynamics through the year. And but what you said is that it's to teach us and teach others. It's funny, Ruth, because in our town this week, there was a town meeting that I did not attend but heard about. And it has to do with passing a non-discrimination clause for LG, the acronym for people who fall into lesbian, gay, trans.
Right. Trans, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And because, and I think, what I heard from the meeting is that there was a mother with a young, a boy who's transitioning to a girl. And just that it's like she would be bullied in the girls' room and beaten up in the boys' room. And that there are people who were in the meeting, many of whom couldn't be very articulate, apparently, from what I heard, who just said, we don't need another thing passed so that a lawyer can come in and sue us if we decide not to offer service to somebody because on religious grounds, we don't want to serve that person because they have on eye makeup. And so a lot of people said, well, I don't see what the big deal is. And to me, we are all being stretched right now in our awareness of what, if something's not affecting us, it still is a part of justice for us to be aware that, have a consciousness to know that someone else may be having a very different experience from us.
Absolutely. And you know that, and when you said that, it brings to mind when I was in my first career as a psychologist, counseling psychologist at the university, the first person I would meet when I came on campus, and the first person who came into my office, and we didn't have the language back then, was a young man who was transitioning into becoming a woman. And he eventually she would say to me, I really thank you because when I came and I began to tell you my story, you accepted me. And here it is, many years ago, and I had no language.
Yeah.
But I saw this human being.
Yeah.
This human being who had these large, doe-like eyes, and she was looking at me, and we were, and then she, and I can remember her making a decision. Shall I tell this woman what's going on with me? And so that's what I'm passing on to our listeners and to anybody else in the world. Remember, there's another person in there with a heart and feelings.
Yeah, it's all about heart right now, and the recognition not to objectify another being's experience and think of them as, well, just because I don't understand their choices, doesn't mean they're not having a real issue with their civil and human rights.
Absolutely.
I was telling the person who attended the meeting that it reminds me of the 50s where, or the 40s, or, when things were in segregation, and people might say, I don't understand why we need to have a town meeting and more rights. These people have their own drinking fountains. They've got their own bathrooms. They've got their own homes and communities. They have jobs. Why is this a big deal? Why do they need
That's
to?
Right.
And it's the same type of energy that came into the town council meeting, because there are people who just don't understand. They feel like, I don't know if I have enough rights, and I don't want my rights infringed upon by giving this strange person over here more rights. And so we're digging deep this year.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And as you were speaking, you brought up a major point, because we're digging deep into that pool of fear. See, Scorpio does not deal with the upper levels. It goes to the heart of the fear. What scares each of us in the night?
I love that you brought that up, because sometimes that's our timer, but we're not done yet. So, and since we didn't have a video show last week and some of our listeners were disappointed, we're going to maybe go a few minutes longer. What do you think?
Yes.
And also just for this, this discussion, I have, Scorpio friends who sometimes speak to me in their language, and it's a very different language from mine, but it is that cautionary tale. Like, Scorpio wants to touch the darkest, it's funny because Halloween is coming up this month, but it wants to be scared. It wants to be like, where, I want to go into that dark cellar room and see what's in there just so that I can face it.
Yes, so I can face it. As a bona fide card carrying moon in Scorpio,
Yeah.
I have to own that it is about having to face those things that you don't see them in the light, but you have to put on those special glasses to go within to see it and to reconcile it. And that's where the healing starts to take place.
And people may be noticing this week that there are things that are keeping them awake at night, trying to discern between maybe a piece of information they've been given and their own intuition in real time, in present time. And I feel like that's very relevant to this, the idea that sometimes we're feeling the boogeyman, in situations, and it may or may not be true or real. And it's up to us to really decide what that is. So I drew, of course, the devil card, which had to do with power structures and the things that bind us. But I also drew the death card, which I don't know. I just was pulling some cards.
You went to the heart of the matter.
And I also drew the Emperor, which is a very constructive card of having a safe, constructive structure for yourself to live in. And that this week, we haven't talked yet about the fact that today on Thursday, we have quite a few squares. So people may be feeling kind of, up in arms and the dynamic tension of the square. So let's talk about that as like.
Well, let me show you my card. Hold your Emperor. Let me hold your Emperor card up.
Okay. Yep.
Because although I'm using Trust Your Vibes by Sonia Choquette, the Oracle, this is the same card. You've got the Emperor, and this is be your own boss. Because if nothing else, the Emperor says, be your own boss.
That's the message for everybody.
That's one of the messages that we're already, and from Jupiter, we're all receiving, be your own boss.
Yep.
And then you were talking about the squares.
Yeah. Well, this is a week of extremes. Let's just say with death and the devil and the Emperor. I mean, oh my God, what do you have there?
Seek solitude. With those other two cards, it's really because we're in the last legs of Cancer, and this would be advantageous today. Would be a remedy to go and find a moment for yourself, wherever that happens to be. Seek solitude, because as we were talking, squares actually get a bad rap, but they're dynamic energy. Their energy, that's what they are. But seeking solitude.
Squares can feel like they're like you're fighting with something in yourself, or you're struggling with something, and that's okay. It's okay. I mean, as with everything, this too shall pass. But I think what you're saying, Ruth, is to embrace that dynamic tension and see how you can be your own boss with that, whatever it is that you're trying to struggle with right now. Like for our listeners, how could you be your own boss this next week? What are some decisions you could make that take you out of a negative power dynamic with other people, and where you're, sometimes we'll spin on another person that, a boss or just somebody that we think has power over us. And this would be a really great week to seek solitude and be your own boss and take some sovereignty back.
Well, actually, we come full circle because we started off our conversation about the uniqueness, and oftentimes we objectify and we project onto another person that they have our power.
Mhm.
But this week, and that dynamic tension that you mentioned with the square
Mhm.
is really about how can I accept my uniqueness?
Hmm.
That's a big question. We've come full circle in our conversation this morning.
Hmm. Well, it certainly is when you look at how we started our conversation when I was talking about the town council initiative, and that, you know, in the 50s, so so I was reflecting on when I was a kid, there were not very many kids who I could identify as trans. And it was just because it was hidden, and it was just, you know, and it kind of reminds me of, if this were the 1950s, how people would say, you know, in their circles, well, is there a problem with the Negroes? I don't know. They seem fine. They have their own
Yes.
fountains. They, you know, and it's because, well, just because somebody's not saying it, they're not coming out because it's not safe. And so having that safety of being uniquely you, um,
And that becomes, so let me say this,
yeah,
Tamara, that becomes something that's really important because it, in some ways it can be one of the most fearsome things to stand apart from the collective, from the cloud, from the crowd, to stand from your peer group, to stand apart from your community.
mm-hmm.
Just as you were pointing out in that council meeting, there were probably people who said, I really feel for the person who's going through the transition to become a trans
Mm-hmm.
person. I really feel for them, but I'm scared to say anything because I live next door to my neighbor.
Yeah, that's a part of it as well. And I always feel that Scorpio, if anybody has the strength or the guts, because it's about the guts, you know, Scorpio is gutsy in that deep way. And we're also referring also to the North Node in Leo, I think, which
Yes,
is still in effect for everyone for the next year, which is that thing of, are you going to listen to what everybody else says all the time?
yes.
Or are you going to have the heart to be in your heart about something and say, this is what's in my heart. I know this isn't popular. I know people don't get it, but I'm just going to be this and honor this heart of mine. And I think this is a time when there's a lot of empowerment for us to go deep and go deeply into fear, like you said, and go deeply into our feelings about power and uniqueness. So there's a lot, and this is going to have to be a continuing conversation.
Yes, it is.
I feel
Let
like,
me bring my
yeah,
last card. This is interesting. My last card
yeah,
is there are people who want to talk and be connected, who want to be in their healing. Find people you can talk shop with.
oh yeah,
I thought this is a great card. Find folks or attract people.
mm-hmm.
If you go into solitude and you ask, let me attract people that I can have wonderful feelings and we can exchange with each other. That will happen. It will
Well,
happen.
so community is important, you know, and
Right,
having
right.
support is important. It's not like we're, you know, no man is an island. We're not standing out, you know, on a cliff by ourselves. But I do think each of us is facing, every time something comes up that's big in the world, everybody collectively, you know, watches it, but individually has their own comeuppance with whatever that thing is. And so, you know, right now we're looking at, you know, sexual misconduct in the world and all kinds of other things. So this is going to be strap in your seatbelt and
Yes, it is. Let me give you one last.
yeah.
I was reading a little article about a young woman in all places in Kenya. She decided that she was going to be a motorcycle taxi driver. Now, all of her community right now
Yeah.
is up in arms because this young woman says, look, I can make more to feed my children, to help them get their uniforms for school and all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And the courage that it has taken, this is today. She's on the African continent,
Mm-hmm.
driving her motorcycle. People are saying, wow, look at her. But that is Scorpio energy right there. To
Yeah,
do
'cause
something that you're afraid of. And she's, she basically said, my community, they said, what kind of woman is she? She she puts on her little leather jacket, she gets her motorcycle, and she endeavors to go out and make a living for herself and her kids.
Well, and again, it's that black and white, do it or don't do it, but know exactly how you feel about it. And, it's do or die too. And I think that maybe that's an interesting continuing conversation for us to have. I want to invite everyone to do something you're afraid of, and find the strength within to have it. And it's probably related to uniqueness and to your own
Yes,
voice,
yes,
and to overthrowing old feelings of being submissive to or victimed, being a victim in a power situation. So, oh my gosh, this is very juicy conversation
yes, it
today.
is. Yes, it
And
is.
we want to thank all of you for listening very much. We'll post the links as always if you want to get a reading with me or with Ruth. Um, Join us for Elements of Wisdom tomorrow, Friday. I'll have archetypal astrologer Sean Nygaard joining me to talk about the mythology of Jupiter and Scorpio too. But Ruth and I are going to continue this conversation.
Yes, we
We'll
are.
have more to
We
talk
can't let go.
about. No. So please like and share the video. Leave a comment. We love you. And we'll see you next week.
See you.